Look, you can't prevent a bad actor from taking an adverse action on your campus. There are really simple steps that are out there that can sometimes be overlooked, like just being explicit about the fact that safety first.
This is In the Know with ACCT, the voice of community college leaders. I'm Jacob Bray. For this episode of In the Know, we interviewed Justin Kollinger, a risk management consultant at United Educators. We talk about risk management on campus and the wide variety of ways colleges can prepare for risk and protect themselves. This is part of a series we curated for College Safety Month and is part one of a two-part episode.
Really effective risk management means that everybody's acting on risk management. It's not just one person's job, it's not two people's job. It's a culture, it's a way of thinking about uncertainty and ambiguity, it's a way of protecting yourself and your institution and your students. And that means bringing together people from across campus, and it means getting them on the same page and not overcomplicating it. One of the things that I've seen when you bring these campus-wide cross-cutting initiatives to the fore, sometimes you don't bring the right people to the table, and sometimes just the process is too hard and you have subject matter experts who come to work every day to do the thing that they're expert at, and they don't come to do work to do the institutional research, to do the risk management. So you have to make it easy. I think back to the behavioral economics, and if you want somebody to do something, these are good people who are well-intentioned and they want to do the right thing, but they also have a lot of other things to do, and so you have to make it easy.
So years ago in DC, we had an earthquake. Nobody had any idea what was happening. Yeah. Number one, we weren't prepared because we didn't even think that was possible. And some of us thought it must be a bomb underground or something. Many of us did the wrong things. There was somebody who needed assistance getting out of the building. We didn't know how to handle that. Everybody in our office and every other office in the area went downstairs outside and basically stood right under the windows. These things that you would never think, like an earthquake in Washington, D.C., until it happened, no one ever would have really prepared for that.
I think it's about having a framework in place. One of the places where we see a real difference between colleges who are really successful with their crisis management plans and ones who struggle a little bit is what we tend to call an all risks approach to a crisis. You cannot possibly have a voluminous tome of every crisis management plan for every situation under the sun. If you managed to put that together, if you managed to list together earthquakes, admission scandals, embezzlement schemes all into one book, it would be unusable because it would just be too much. Instead, what I think colleges who do a really good job of crisis management do, they pick up a framework that allows them to be flexible. And so there might be really firm plans for the most common emergencies, fires, or some of the most catastrophic, like school shootings. For ones like earthquakes in the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic, you might not have an earthquake preparedness plan, and until I think that was 2011, you might not have needed one, and you might not need one in the future. But what you do need is you need to have a plan that says, here's the communication flows. When something weird happens, know that you need to check your text messages, your email accounts, so on and so forth. Have floor marshals who are trained in building evacuations and who know what to do in the event of major natural crises. Have clear lines of communication among the leadership of the school, any other key players in risk. So I'm thinking about the public safety directors or the police directors, and also clear lines of communication among the board too. And so knowing that when there is a crisis, all 12 members of the board probably shouldn't raise their hands to jump up at the same time. Right. Know which board member and which board member serves backup as point person for a crisis, a natural disaster crisis, a legal crisis, or so forth.
You know, when we were talking to the president of the Yuba Community College District last week, one of the things that he said was most important that they didn't realize at first, but eventually came to realize is communication. Like something that's as simple as making sure that you have a way or a channel to get in touch with your entire student body or your faculty as quickly and as efficiently as possible really makes a big difference.
I was talking to a public relations executive, and she works exclusively in higher education. One of the things that she pointed out is that colleges are oftentimes actually pretty good at the operational response to a crisis. And that's largely because they have subject matter experts who know what they're doing when these crises happen. And that's actually an advantage that I think education has over some of the corporate world. You become a leader in the corporate world based on your management skills, your financial acumen, but you aren't necessarily good at knowing what to do when something really specific to a subject area happens. Mm-hmm. Higher ed has that, and I think that's a great foundation, but the communications piece is often lacking. And there's a lot that goes into that, both in the health and safety of your constituents, so making sure that you have those text messages, those email communications that go out, but then also protecting your reputation on the back end, or even enhancing your reputation because you handled a crisis really well. You can look at the news, you can look at Inside Higher Ed, you can look at the Chronicle, and you can see a struggle about that every week coming out of some college, university, somewhere in the country. But when you're able to structure that communication flows, whether it's having a plan already in place for the most common types of crises, or having a PR expert who's on retainer, who knows your mission, who knows your constituents, who knows your audiences. And I say audiences plural because you have your students, you have your faculty, you have your community members, particularly for community colleges, you have your legislators. Knowing how to handle all of those constituencies in a quick and effective way after a crisis happens is critical to protecting their reputation. And like I said, even building on that reputation moving forward.
Let's just start at the beginning. How would you qualify or define a resilient college? What are the most defining factors?
Yeah. It's funny. I don't know that there's a really good way to say that one college is more resilient than another. I can't go to a college campus and say this college is 5 more resilient than the other college. But that said, there is definitely a real tangible difference when there's a college that's really resilient versus one that's going to be flimsy in the face of crisis, frankly. And I like to think of it internally and externally. I think internally, with your own staff, resilience comes from having executive team leaders who are flexible, who are able to handle ambiguity, and who know how to communicate in a crisis. When you have those kind of key baseline elements, then it becomes pretty easy, quote unquote easy, to build communications plans, crisis management plans. I think that tends to flow a little bit better. When you're talking externally, a resilient college is one who has some of that reputational capital built up. I like to think of reputational capital as almost like a currency, where you're always either building it or spending it. And so as soon as a new president comes to campus, there's a great chance for that president to build reputational capital. And so that reputational capital builds up when there's a crisis. You spend some of that reputational capital. Hopefully you still have a positive balance and you survive to the next crisis. Where you see colleges and universities stumble is whenever they haven't either built up that capital or that currency, or they spend it repeatedly because there's too many crises. And I think to some of the big national universities and the crises they faced, I think Penn State, I think Virginia Tech, I think University of North Carolina and the athletics and academics scandal that they had a few years ago. These are all really respected universities, and I don't want to downplay the immediate impact that those events all had on the people who were involved. Obviously, what happened at Penn State, what happened at Virginia Tech were terrible incidents that shattered lives, quite frankly. But if I'm thinking about the institution, they survived as institutions, and in some cases even thrived, because they had such strong reputations with their external communities, and that helped them really rebuild and continue to be the influential organizations they are today.
There's some inherent spending of capital that's beyond anybody's control. But I think you said earlier that all of this is really, it's a culture. Risk management is a culture. So how would you say, not to keep hammering in on this, but not to qualify a resilient college, but how would you, what are some of the factors or a list that, for example, board members, the president could run down to ask themselves, am I resilient? Is our risk management in order? Are there any specifics that could help people sort of do a self-evaluation in those terms?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first one is are there actually written plans available? And I want to make that distinction about written plans. Because I think it's very easy for somebody to walk into a board meeting and say, we have a plan for this. But what does that plan look like? I think is a great follow-up question. Can I see the plan? Do these other key stakeholders know that this plan exists? And I think those are some of the key questions. This is baseline. Do we have a resilient college? Well, you better be able to bounce back and respond to a crisis if you're going to be resilient. I don't want to harp too much on finances because I don't think finances necessarily qualify a college as resilient, but you do need to have the money available to get through a crisis, whatever the case may be. If you need to hire a PR, crisis communications firm, if you need to hire attorneys, you need to have that flexibility. I don't want to harp on that too much as a overall characteristic because I think that probably doesn't place the emphasis in the right spot. But then after that, it's about I think, again, culture is a really hard thing to put your finger on. But having the staff and the leadership who all genuinely care about risk, and I know that's a hard thing to talk about because who says they don't care about risk? But working as a risk management consultant for United Educators, we see plenty of leaders who say they care about risk with and don't back it up with plans and with an emphasis on ambiguity and an emphasis on saying, well, what if X, Y, Z happens? I think about some of the sexual assault, sexual misconduct, sexual predation cases that we've been seeing in the media lately. And we continue to talk to organizations, or to colleges and universities rather, who they say it couldn't happen here. And to me, that's not a risk-aware culture. If you think that you're immune to really just about any risk that's out there, that's a pretty good indication that you're not paying attention. It was really remarkable to me to see how many really high-level leaders at, and here I'm speaking about four-year universities, but how many high-level leaders at four-year universities are kind of putting their heads in the sand when it comes to sexual predation and sexual assault, and then also some at community colleges and small private four-year institutions as well who say, couldn't happen here, we're a family.
It's kind of frustrating to me that, it's so frequent, especially with the sexual assault stuff, that the short-term plan seems to be to bury your head in the sand.
Yeah.
And that really is a short-term plan, and in many instances a very, very, very short-term plan.
Yeah.
And the long-term solution is really, as simple as, just starting the conversation, saying, hey, like you said, what do we have in place? And if we don't have anything in place, let's start talking about, getting something in place.
Right. Look, you can't prevent a bad actor from taking an adverse action on your campus. It's literally impossible to prevent it. However, you can reduce the likelihood of that event. You can reduce the impact of that event. I worked recently with a K-12 independent school, and they were kind of taken aback by the idea of reducing the impact of sexual assault on their campus. And I understand why. It's something that it hits so close to home, and it's such an emotional thing, and it's so terrible for the victim. But there's a really big difference between having 2 victims and having 20 victims. And when I talk about reducing the impact, it's about having reporting mechanisms in place that when a staff member or a student says, I think something might be fishy there, that it's safe for that person to raise that as a concern. And then it's also safe to conduct an investigation that is simply trying to find facts. You don't want to be in a situation where allegations are flying all over the place, of course, but I think that is mitigated against by having a really honest investigation system where you're not trying to go out to get anybody. You're really trying to protect your students, and you're trying to protect your communities. And that can be the difference between 2 victims and 20 victims.
I think also a couple of things that you said really stand out to me. I mean, for one thing, I think in a way, when you're fact-finding, when you're trying to figure out what's really going on, if there's an accusation, presuming innocence of a perpetrator you're protecting them as well if you find the facts and the facts show that, that there's no basis for this. Of course, people's reputations can be damaged, yes. But nevertheless, as you said, any extra one person who is victimized or harmed or killed, in some instances, it's very difficult to make any excuse for not having gone to the trouble of doing it. Particularly with this issue, with sexual misconduct on campus, I am frankly really surprised that this is an issue that anybody at this point would say this doesn't happen here. Looking at the higher education media, for the past 5 years, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, I feel like every other cover deals with this issue in one way or another. Mm-hmm. And there's a definite responsibility on the part of any institution to make sure that they have protocols in place, because these things do happen. So tell me about the institutions that say this doesn't happen here. In a general sense, how can they think that, and how do they end up resisting implementing any kind of process to protect their students?
Yeah. I think it's human, to be honest, and because as people, we want to come to our places of work, whether it's a campus or a corporate office, it almost doesn't matter. We want to come to our place of work, and we want to trust the people around us. We want to give them the benefit of the doubt, and we want to think we work in places that reflect our own values. And I would certainly hope that most people's values are ones that think that this is a place that can be safe from sexual assault and sexual misconduct.
This question that we had discussed, what sorts of risks are less common but could pose serious threats to colleges? So, for example, talking about the personal nature, as you were, about sexual misconduct. For example, anything that happens among your peers, your family, so to speak, within your community, certainly a natural disaster in a way may psychologically be easier to prepare for because it's objective. It's nobody's fault when a hurricane comes blowing through. And then on-campus shootings, there are reasons why that has risen to the top of people's concerns. But could you talk about what we talked about off mic about this question, about less common but serious threats, and then the inverse of that?
I don't actually like framing it as less common but more serious threats, because I actually think as humans we're really good at handling those. If you think about what some of the most common fears people have are things like dying in a plane crash, of murder, of really violent acts. Frankly, those are relatively uncommon. You're much more likely to die in a fire. You're much more likely to die in a car crash. And I don't know very many people who are terrified of stepping into the car every morning. And I don't say this, listeners, as a way to try to scare you to drive to work in the morning. But we really, as humans, are good at the sensational, at the extreme. And thus, as a result, a lot of colleges have pretty strong procedures in place for things like school shootings. Mm-hmm. But they're not necessarily as prepared for sexual misconduct, because that's something that is kind of hits at the culture of who you are. They're not quite as prepared for things like workplace harassment. United Educators, it's one of the most frequent claims that we see is workplace harassment. You want to think that your coworkers around you are generally good people, and particularly if you're at a high level in an organization, whether you're a board or you're an executive, you want to think that if there is something bad in your organization, if there is workplace harassment, well, maybe it's my fault as a leader for fostering this culture. So I want to push that thought out of my brain, and I want to trust that this is a great place. And thus it becomes very easy to overlook. Mm-hmm. Or I think about deferred maintenance. I'd love to know a community college in this country that doesn't have problems with deferred maintenance. I'll expand that out to four-year universities as well. That is a pretty common issue. It can become serious. I think it manifests itself in a regular way as non-serious issues. It manifests its way as, oh, the toilet's backed up again. Oh, the HVAC unit went out. But it can also present itself as really serious things like balcony collapses. Those are things that I don't think we think about as serious risks, but they're some of the most common ones we face.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I was just thinking about this in comparison to city regulations, about how cities maintain this type of stuff. And like in New York, every 5 years, the exterior of a building has to be checked to make sure nothing's going to fall off.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because what used to happen, especially when window air conditioner units were becoming more popular, is they'd be installed poorly and they'd fall out of the window and hit someone.
Yeah.
So it's every 5 years that they're going around and making sure that everything's fine. And if it's not, it's immediately taken care of. And that's not the way I think most schools are approaching something like that, you might not even think about on a day-to-day basis.
Right. There's all these little things on campuses that have the potential to turn into really serious things. I think of the admissions crisis or scandal as one of those. I'm a former admissions counselor, both for undergraduate and graduate schools. And when that happened, I think a lot of people around me were shocked. And when I heard about it, I thought, I hadn't thought that this would ever happen, but it makes perfect sense to me. Because you have a group of employees who are poorly paid, in many cases are poorly paid, have high stress, in a competitive, results-driven job where they are in a position of power relative to their constituents. And in many cases work with those constituents behind closed doors. So to me, whenever I heard all of the details, I said, you know what? I hadn't thought about that before, but that makes sense. I'm not surprised. And it's ultimately a result of these structures that we have in place at many institutions that put people in positions where 99.9% of people handle that without any problems. But the 0.01% of people see an opportunity for something unethical, and they kind of jump at the opportunity when it presents itself. And I know that I'm obviously talking about a 4-year college and university problem here, but this is a real trickle-down effect on community colleges. I think of the admissions scandal as actually being a large risk for the higher ed sector as a whole. Community colleges get wrapped up in it despite being open access and serving a large number of students nationwide. If the federal government were to come in and say, we're going to start taxing endowments and foundations because we can't trust these organizations to manage their money and be fair to students coming in, well, guess who gets wrapped up in that? All the community colleges who have foundations, all of the small private four-years with tiny endowments, all because there were a few bad actors at a few large universities. And so when we think some of these scandals of being removed from community colleges, it's all one sector. And when there's adverse action taken against the sector, community colleges go with it. But I also think that's a real opportunity for community colleges too, when we're thinking about some of these structural issues and some of these processes, for community college leaders and board members to step up in their communities and say, I'm a powerful representative who can advocate for this organization that I care a lot about. And I can make the case that we are different. We are a valued contributor to this community, and that we should not be adversely affected by the acts of others.
This has been part 1 of a 2-part episode with Justin Kollinger. Make sure you subscribe so you receive a notification when we release part 2 on Thursday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.